Our text for this morning's communion meditation is John chapter 5, verses 1 through 18. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda, or also some translations say Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many ill, blind, lame, and paralyzed people. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The ill man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." But he answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." For this reason the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. May God bless this reading of the Word. When Rhonda and I were in seminary in Berkeley, we crossed paths often with organizations and people in the community who work to better the lives of the neighbors in need. One such group was the Center for Independent Living. They worked with people who lived with various types of disabilities, but who did not want to be known by a disability. And I used to see a man in the neighborhood in a motorized wheelchair rolling down the sidewalks of Berkeley. And besides being confined to the wheelchair, he was unable to speak. In front of him, he had attached a Ouija board on his wheelchair, and he had a pointer attached on a headband to his head. And so if he was asked a yes or a no question, he could point on the Ouija board to yes or no. And if the answer to the question required a longer answer, he would laboriously spell it out by pointing to letters of the alphabet on that board. And on the back of his wheelchair was a sticker which advertised the Center for Independent Living. On one occasion, as I was leaving our apartment, I noticed this man had run his wheelchair into the bushes. And he looked stuck, but fortunately I restrained my youthful urge to rush over and pull his chair back onto the pavement. Instead, I asked him, "Do you need help?" Quickly, he pointed with the wand on his head to the Ouija board and the word no. He was determined to handle the situation by himself. I imagine that he wanted to occupy a place in the community that was something more than just being that guy who occasionally got his wheelchair stuck in the bushes. Our text this morning tells of an encounter that Jesus had one day in Jerusalem with a disabled man. We are not told the man's name, but we are told that he had lived with his condition for 38 years. He was one of many lying around that pool of Bethesda near the temple that day. People believed that the pool itself had healing power. So Jesus asked him directly, "Do you want to be healed?" In asking that question, Jesus gave that man a share in his own recovery. Jesus was prepared to do something with the man rather than to him. Jesus was inviting him to begin to accept the radical change in his life which healing would bring after 38 years. The first verse of our text tells us why Jesus happened to be in Jerusalem that day. It says, "After this there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." At that time there were 3 pilgrimage festivals: the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or Passover. And we're not told which of these 3 was taking place in this story. But these were occasions when all able-bodied men were expected to journey to Jerusalem to celebrate together. And the temple would have been the central gathering place. Near the temple was this very large pool where those with various physical needs gathered, hoping for a cure. They were a crowd, but not a community. We read in verses 2 and 3, "Now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate there is a pool called in Hebrew Bethesda or Bethesda, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many ill, blind, lame, and paralyzed people." Scholars tell us that this pool of Bethesda was roughly the size of a football field and was over 20 feet deep. So here we have a large group of the disabled waiting for a cure of some sort, while a great religious festival was being observed in the temple which stood next door. And Jesus' attention was drawn to one man in this great crowd of neediness. The World Health Organization estimates that there are perhaps as many as 1 billion people on the planet who deal with some type of disability, approximately 15% of the world's population. People with disabilities experience increased dependency and restricted participation in their societies. And even in high-income countries, 20 to 40% of people with disabilities lack the help they require to engage in everyday activities. In the United States, 70% of adults living with disabilities rely on family and friends for assistance with their daily activities. Our text challenges us this morning, I think, with this question: how well do we do as congregations of Jesus' disciples in making our physical spaces as well as our communal life and decision-making accessible to our neighbors with disabilities? This is not a once and done question. It's the question we have to take up repeatedly. To be faithful to the Jesus pattern, we need to look for our own pools of Bethesda. Is there anyone left on the outside looking in? And how well do we do working with people rather than merely doing something for them or to them? Today's text tells the story of how Jesus healed a man by the pool of Bethesda on the Sabbath. In verses 8 and 9 we read, Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was the Sabbath. I remember that as a child we had many rules in my family about what we could and could not do on the Sabbath. We did not mow the lawn or paint the house on Sunday. We did not play sports outside. We did not go to the movies. We did not go shopping. Of course, there weren't that many stores open at that time on Sundays anyway. What we could do was to attend Sunday school and worship in the morning, and then come back for youth group and a second worship service Sunday evening. Now, I was allowed to deliver my paper route early Sunday morning while it was still dark, but I was not allowed to collect from my customers on Sunday. There were many prohibitions, but not as many permissions. Jesus and the unnamed man of our story were challenged by the religiously observant for what they were doing on a Sabbath. Jesus was confronted for healing on the Sabbath and the man for carrying his mat. It would have been permissible if friends had carried the mat with him, still lying on it. A few years ago, I drove a mother and her sick child to Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and I noticed that one of the elevators at CHOP was designated a Sabbath elevator. I hadn't seen that sign before in the elevators, and so I had to look that up when I arrived home. And I learned that a Sabbath elevator is one which works in a special mode, operating automatically to satisfy the Jewish law requiring Jews to abstain from operating electrical switches on the Sabbath. We realize that these rules of Sabbath observance in the Jewish community are not our rules, and it would be easy for us perhaps to be impatient or dismissive regarding all the Sabbath rules in Jesus' time or in our own time. Certainly nobody likes to be ticketed by the Sabbath police, but this story in the Gospel of John is not a diatribe against Jews. We must remind ourselves that everyone in our story this morning was Jewish. Jesus, the man who needed healing, and those confronting them in the temple that day. At its best, however, Sabbath observance is a spiritual discipline which seeks to honor God and to be faithful to the covenant between God and God's people. It is God's invitation to build rest into the rhythm of our lives. As a chaplain, Rhonda once was called to visit a Jewish patient in the hospital where she was serving. This woman needed a life-saving procedure, and she needed to sign a release for that to happen. But it was the Sabbath, and this lady was prohibited from writing her whole signature on the Sabbath. She explained that she would not want to offend her Creator by transgressing the Sabbath restrictions. And she did not chafe at the restrictiveness of the Sabbath, but rather she observed it joyfully because of her love for God. But still, she needed this life-saving procedure. So that day, with a little research on the part of the hospital staff, everyone discovered that on the Sabbath for her, it was permissible to make no more than 2 marks with one's weaker hand. And so she was able to make a very shaky X to sign her assent to the procedure. While our own work ought to pause for some kind of Sabbath, God's labor does not. The rabbis had recognized that some of God's work continued on the Sabbath. They taught that God uses 3 keys on the Sabbath: the key to birth, the key to rainfall, and the key to resurrection of the dead. Christian author Leslie Newbegin explains it seems to have been accepted by the rabbis that God's Sabbath rest did not mean that he had ceased to give life. For babies are born on the Sabbath and rain falls. God is always, even on the Sabbath, the giver of life. Jesus encountered opposition that day not only because it was a Sabbath, but also especially because he claimed to have this close relationship with God the Father. Listen again to verses 17 and 18. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working. For this reason the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. In Philippians chapter 2, the Apostle Paul reminds us that Christ did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but instead emptied himself and took the form of a servant. He came in complete harmony with his heavenly Father, bringing life to whoever would accept it. We recall that John's Gospel tells that beautiful story of Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well. And you remember perhaps that Jesus offered her living water. That's what Jesus brought to this man who had been waiting for so many years to slip into the bubbling water of the pool of Bethesda. Living water, life-giving water that would make him whole. Jesus' response to his critics that day may be taken as a promise to you and to me and to all who surround the pool of human need. My Father is still working, and I also am working. And Christ calls us to join him in that work, seeking out the Bethesdas of our world and inviting people into the full fellowship of God's people. Amen.